podcast listeners, welcome to the NK News Podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and today it is Wednesday, May 10th, 2023. I'm joined here in the NK News studio by Kathleen Stephens to talk about her time as ambassador to the Republic of Korea and the present and possible future of U.S.-North Korea relations. But first, please, a request and a reminder to leave a review about this podcast episode on whatever platform you use and share this episode with everyone you think who should hear it and who might be interested. And what's more, like and subscribe to the whole series. New episodes come out every Tuesday, Korea time. Second, check out nknews.org, where each day my journalist colleagues write the best North Korea-focused journalism. A subscription for a year costs less than $1 a day, and that helps to fund the excellent reporting that my colleagues produce each and every day, as well as this very podcast. Thirdly, follow nknews.org on Twitter and me at JackoZ. Now, to introduce my guest today, Kathleen Stephens first came to South Korea as a Peace Corps volunteer from 1975 to 77 before joining the U.S. Foreign Service in 78. She served as internal political unit chief at the embassy in Seoul starting in 1984, but she actually came in 83 for language classes to 87, and principal officer at the U.S. consulate in Busan from 87 to 89. Her triumphal return in 2008 to become the first female ambassador from the United States to South Korea created a media sensation in this country. Ambassador Stephens now serves as chair of the board at the Korea Society in New York and as president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute in Washington, D.C. You can find her on Twitter at @ambstephens. Welcome on the show, Ambassador Stephens.
Thank you, Jacko. It's great to join you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a big admirer of your podcast and everything you do at NK News.
I'm very grateful. Well, yeah, it's great to have you. I know that we first started this conversation when you and I met in New York at the Korea Society in January 2020, just as COVID was kicking off.
Yeah.
And almost 3.5 years later, here we are.
Yeah.
So I'd better make this worth the wait for the audience. Now, during your first tour here with the Department of State in the mid-1980s, you saw a lot of student radical activism, some of it strongly in support of Kim Il-sung and North Korea and wanting sort of unification now and almost ready to march north into Pyongyang. Did that initially surprise you after your experiences with the Peace Corps in the 1970s?
Well, thanks for starting in the 1980s, now 40 years ago, isn't it? As you mentioned in your very kind introduction, I might quibble with the word triumphal, but thank you very much. I always feel triumphal myself when I come back to Seoul. It's great to be back here today. I was in Korea for 2 years in the 1970s. When I came back just 5 years later, Park Chung-hee was gone,
Right.
Chun Doo-won was in power, and suddenly I was doing what Peace Corps volunteers never did, and that was delve into Korean politics.
Yeah.
So in the 1980s, as I joined the embassy as a political officer, my beat was what we call domestic politics. So with that, yes, students were very active, as they have been in many periods in Korean history,
Yeah.
even going back before the establishment of the Republic of Korea, but very active. And in a time of still authoritarianism, but gradual liberalization compared to the Yushin Constitution, which I'd seen in the 1970s, Korean students had been exposed a little bit to the forbidden fruit, if you like, of more things about North Korea, more things about the outside world. And so there certainly was a kind of a radicalization occurring in some quarters. But I'm sorry for that long introduction, but I would say as I met with students, and it was always challenging to meet and get their trust, and I was, after all, an American diplomat.
Yeah.
I don't recall any student ever saying to my face, let's march north and reunify with Kim Il-sung. They were really curious. You know, it was like, again, the forbidden fruit. Certainly some were radicalized, and I don't think I met some of those who were perhaps the most radicalized, but they were curious. They wanted to know really what was behind the division of Korea, what was North Korea really like, and they were very skeptical about what they'd been taught and told over their years growing up.
Okay, now, there was that time when some radical students occupied the U.S. Information Service, your information office in downtown Seoul, and you had to go and meet with them. Were they talking about North Korea, or what was their major beef?
No, they were talking about democratization. No, those students were talking about democratization in Korea. They were talking about what they regarded as, and this was a prime issue for them, the U.S. role, and what they believed was a very negative role in preventing democratization following the assassination of Chun Doo-won, and what they saw, after the assassination of Park Chung-hee, and what they saw as American complicity or worse in the tragedy of Gwangju in May 1980. That's where they were focused. Now, there were many within the government and within the Korean public who said they're just puppets for the North.
Right.
They didn't feel that they were. This was something deeply held that they were, and they wanted to get the attention of Americans, and they wanted to get the attention of their own people and the government. And I would also add that the occupation of the U.S. Cultural Center here in Seoul was the first of several events. There was one in Busan in 1982 with the firebombing of our cultural center there.
Yeah.
And again, the immediate cause was Gwangju. Apologize for Gwangju, explain Gwangju, and this was a leitmotif in the students' agenda through those years.
Have you met any of those radical students in more recent years and seen how they've changed in their positions or in their thinking?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the just extraordinary things, it's always extraordinary to live in Korea, as I think you can attest, and many of us can. But living in Korea from 1983 through 1989 I saw over those years what none of us, I'd say, predicted come as things do in Korea sometimes very quickly.
Right.
And that was a direct election of the president and the establishment of a constitution, which is still the constitution today.
Yep.
Now, talking about Korea's democratic journey is maybe not the subject of this broadcast, but it was an incredible thing to witness. And that's a whole story in itself.
And you were there throughout the middle of all that.
And I was there, throughout all of that. But I'm sorry, I forgot what your question was to me now.
Whether some of the student radicals who you knew back in the 80s.
Oh, I saw, of course.
Yeah.
So I am a little bit of a Rip Van Winkle when it comes to Korea because I left in 1989,
right.
Went back to the United States. The Cold War was ending in Europe, and I ended up spending the next 15 years working on European issues.
Right.
So when I came back to Korea, for the first time since leaving in 1980, in 2005, as an official from the State Department, yes, I did find some of those that I knew in the 1980s, and many had gone into politics, which is what you want. Yeah. And some were very much part of the Democratic Party, what we consider to be the party that came out of the democratization movement.
Yeah.
Some had moved into the Conservative Party. Some had bounced back and forth.
Right.
Some had gone to jail. It was really an extraordinary thing. And not just the students, but I had the privilege in the 1980s of knowing the political leaders then, including Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam. And they'd already been president. And if you'd asked me in the 1980s, were they going to be president someday, especially Kim Dae-jung, the answer would have been highly unlikely. So it really was a chance to catch up, if you like, on the incredible political journey that now seems, in retrospect, everything's like, well, of course it happened. That's, but it wasn't foretold,
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. You served as ambassador from 2008 to 2011, which was a time when a lot of significant things happened on the Korean Peninsula, and many of them involving North Korea. And so I'll try to go through as many of them as we can. But first, let's discuss your Senate confirmation process. You were named ambassador in late 2007, but didn't arrive until October 2008. And I think if I did my research correctly, your Senate confirmation was stalled by Senator Sam Brownback, who didn't want there to be further six-party negotiations with North Korea. Is that more or less accurate?
That's more or less accurate. I mean, I think he was actually saying that he wanted to see more attention to the issue of human rights in North Korea.
Okay. So tell us a bit about that process of confirmation. What was that like?
Well, I mean, in a sort of historical perspective, that long march through confirmation is not atypical. And I have numerous friends right now in a very different environment being nominated to other countries who are also in a long confirmation process. Some of it is just a feature, if not a bug, of the American political system. But yes, when I was nominated in late 2007 or early 2008 by President George W. Bush, we were still working on pushing forward in the six-party talks. And there was considerable opposition, especially, ironically enough, from within President Bush's own party and his own administration, from those who thought that the six-party talks were legitimizing the North Koreans, overlooking the issue of human rights, and my nomination was a way, I think, of highlighting their concerns about that process. So yes, I had to deploy, I guess I would say, some of my diplomatic skills to work through that confirmation process. But I
Right.
did, and I made it here.
Nice.
And stayed on through President Obama's election, and served, of course, most of the time under his administration.
Right, and as you point out, that a lot of that stalling was due to the perceived lack of attention on human rights, and there's still to this day, and there are still members of both sides in the House and the Senate in the United States who don't like negotiating with North Korea if that means that we don't discuss human rights in a very upfront way. So I'm just wondering, given that, how can U.S. and North Korea negotiations ever move forward in a sustained way? Given that sort of, if negotiations are going well, then there's a perceived lack of attention to human rights. But then if you focus on the human rights, then there's no negotiations.
Yeah, well, that's an issue of balancing that is not unique to diplomacy with North Korea. I think it's true of negotiations you carry out almost anywhere. I mean, generally, the important negotiations we carry out when it's on, especially on issues of war and peace, if you like, are not with our friends, they're with our adversaries. And it's always a question of how you, as I said, how you approach that, both in terms of so-called carrots and sticks, but in terms of prioritizing issues. But I think that there's the issue of paying attention to North Korean human rights has been, and I mean this in a good way, institutionalized internationally and within the American political system. And I think that it's important to keep calling attention to human rights. But I don't think that that's a reason not to sit down with people, because I think you also have, when you're thinking about human rights, think about what are we saying because we feel we have an obligation to say it, or simply because we feel badly if we don't point this out. And how are we actually going to make a difference to the people in North Korea, to the long-suffering Koreans on the other side of this peninsula? And the first question is a little easier than the latter one, right? So I think some of the steps have been taken in the ensuing years to really pay attention to the situation of North Koreans who have left North Korea, whether they've gone to China or South Korea or the United States or elsewhere, to look at how we can bring some humanitarian assistance, even in the most dire of circumstances. It's been very difficult with COVID. And really, as to what it means to take a more practical approach to improving the situation on the ground, as well as being unflinching in pointing out that this is not the way that a country can treat its citizens or should treat its citizens in the 21st century.
Now, you point out that human rights has become institutionalized. Some would argue that it's been weaponized in a way to sort of beat North Korea over the head. Would you agree with that characterization?
I think that there have been times when human rights has been perceived, but certainly by the North Koreans and probably by a lot of others, as kind of code for regime change. And there is an argument that under this odious regime, nothing's really possible. So that gets into a different kind of argument. Are you trying for something incremental change to make it better? This is a perennial in diplomacy and in life.
Right.
Or are you saying this is hopeless? And if it's regime change, then you're faced with a whole other set of very challenging choices. And how do you go through with those? So I think I wouldn't call it weaponized exactly, but I do think that we have to be clear about and honest about what our tools are and what we're willing to do, what's possible.
Let's talk about the SixParty Talks to find I think the full name is the SixParty Talks to find a peaceful resolution to security concerns as a result of the North Korean nuclear weapons program. It's quite a mouthful.
I never heard the full title before. That's very impressive.
I might have made that up. There were 5 rounds of this is background for our listeners here. There were 5 rounds of talks held from 2003 to 2007, and in that first year, 2003, North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it had signed. And one of your predecessors as ambassador to Seoul here, Christopher Hill, was ambassador. He was just for about a year from 2004 to 2005 before leaving to take up the position of Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, where he oversaw the Six-Party Peace Talks. From the beginning from the 4th round, taking over from James Kelly, who had done it before him. Meanwhile, from June 2005, you were Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. How did you play a supporting role for the SixParty Talks in Washington, D.C.?
I fought some of the Washington battles, and I had a former boss in the European Bureau who used to say, you just save your best diplomacy for the interagency process. And so while Chris Hill was negotiating with the North Koreans and the Chinese and the others, I was trying to address the interagency in Washington, and of course also manage the Bureau, which does take care of more than Korea. It's the entire East Asian and Pacific.
Yeah.
But maybe just as a little bit of background, I mean, I might mention, you mentioned Chris Hill being ambassador here and then leaving after a short time to go back to Washington. This was in just as the second term of George W. Bush began. And there was a sense, and you can read all about this actually now in Chris Hill's book called Outpost, which is his memoir. But of course, I remember this well. Since Chris called me, I was also actually working on Balkan affairs then and asked me to come to the Bureau to be his deputy when he was called back to do this job, especially focused on North Korea. We had actually first met in Korea, interesting enough, in the 80s.
Wow.
Chris was an economics officer and I was a political officer, and hadn't worked together since then, but we had that Korea tie. So anyway, that's a little bit of background. But Chris in 2005 was asked by Secretary Condi Rice and President George W. Bush to try to get these talks going, in large part because the then government in Seoul, this is the Roh Moo-hyun government, was very unhappy that we were at such a dead end, if you like, vis-a-vis North Korea. So there was a sense that this is important to our ally. We need to work with them. And we needed, frankly, some diplomatic progress somewhere. Iraq and Afghanistan weren't going so well. Yeah. And we wanted to see if diplomacy could work. So in the early days of 2005, with the Chinese, very different world when we think where we are now, in the chair, we did get all the six parties to Beijing and to agree to a broad joint statement of principles, which still reads pretty well these days as to where we would have liked and still would like things to be. But we ran into some immediate problems, of course, because the North Koreans were very unhappy. This will sound very familiar, very unhappy that at the same time that we were negotiating, we weren't stopping the pressure. Right. And we had frozen some money that they were very unhappy about in a Macau bank account. So
the Banco Delta Asia.
The Banco Delta Asia. So, and in the meantime, we had in Washington a lot of voices, including within the administration, and much of this is in Chris's book, and you can read about elsewhere to get other perspectives. Yeah. So there was a battle going on in Washington about should we be talking to them at all.
Right. I mean, there was a lot of voices talking or arguing for regime change.
There were. There's no point in. Was this ever serious?
Was that ever George Bush's policy?
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, I think, again, if you look at the history of U.S. engagement on the issue of North Korea over the years, and I know you've had some great people on this program, but, whenever an American president has looked at what the options are, when Ambassador Laney was here in the 1990s, right before the agreed framework was negotiated, President Clinton came close to ordering some kind of military strike on North Korea. Now, that wasn't designed to be regime change. It was designed to try to slow down their missile program, or stop their missile program. But the dangers of military action on this peninsula are something, again, for a Korean audience, I don't think we need to overstate, because I think it's pretty apparent to everyone. And of course, you fast forward to the days of fire and fury of only the last few years, the Trump administration, then you see again this time when you look at these things. I mean, in principle, it sounds like, gosh, we really should be able to do something about this. But it turns out that our priorities are, we've got to be sure we're working with Seoul. If we can, we've got to work with others in the neighborhood. And we've got to find a way to both bring pressures to change the context, as we like to say in diplomacy sometimes, on the North Koreans to get us to a better place and to try to move this forward. But diplomacy doesn't mean all soft things. It means some hard things too. But some kind of diplomacy and engagement is far preferable to the risks of a full-on military kinetic encounter, which, we've been fortunate to have deterred, if you like, and to have avoided for the last 70 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so there you were doing your diplomatic role within the agencies or among the agencies in Washington. And how did you coordinate and collaborate with Ambassador Hill's team in Beijing?
Well, by telephone. I remember, for example, in September 2005, it was the UN General Assembly in New York. And so we had all of our ministers there, which meant Condi Rice, Secretary of State. Ban Ki-moon was then Foreign Minister for Korea.
Right.
And the Japanese Foreign Minister and others. And I was sitting with Secretary Rice, as were others, as she met sequentially with each of these foreign ministers to talk about this joint statement of principles that at the same time Ambassador Hill was negotiating in Beijing with his counterparts around the table. So we stayed in very close touch that way.
So like a parallel process.
Kind of like a parallel process, but at the same time, and again, I'm not giving away any secrets here because enough time has passed, people have all written their memoirs.
Right.
There were real efforts within the administration itself, ironically, and I'm not even talking about in Congress, but within the administration, to say we really shouldn't be doing this. But it was always clear that Secretary Rice and most importantly, President Bush wanted to see this go forward. And time again, they empowered Chris to try to move forward. But things after that joint statement was agreed in September 2005, then we had a period of about 18 months, which because of this Banco Delta Asia program, and because sometimes when you have sanctions, it's kind of hard to unwind them.
Right.
You know, Chris used to compare it to a doomsday machine. You know, usually you apply sanctions so that you can sort of get something out of them at the end, but sometimes it's hard to unwind them.
Yeah.
So we went through some time of not making any progress, and then finally getting to the point where we had IAEA inspectors going back to Yeonpyeong, it being closed down, but still the suspicions now about and it turned out to be well-founded suspicions about the uranium enrichment program. So I think there you have another example of how do you balance things, and is the perfect the enemy of the good? And right. I'm not arguing that you always have to settle for second best. Some things you have to resolve, but how do you do those things sequentially? How important are the missiles? Do you take shutting down the plutonium project and having people on the ground there?
Yep.
As a good first step, even knowing that there's probably, in the word that people use all the time, cheating going on
right.
when it came to other things, such as a uranium enrichment program. I mean, it's not easy.
No.
And I'm not saying that everything was done right, but I will say that one thing I think that came out of that period, which was kind of resolved almost at that time, is there was this notion, again, early on in 2005, that the U.S. should never meet with the North Koreans alone. You know, it was like, I don't know, Victorian England or something, you know, that you had to have a chaperone at all times. And
right.
That, I think, has gone, I mean, in a big way, kind of by the wayside, you know, that of course we can meet. Now, the problem now, I guess if we get into talking about now, is relationships in the region have changed so much, especially vis-a-vis China, that putting together a kind of a multilateral formation as we did then really obviously would not happen the same way now.
No. Now, then, of course, there was that day, I remember it well, I was here in Seoul, and I got a phone call from a journalist friend of mine. North Korea had conducted its first nuclear test. That was on October 9th, 2006. How did that impact your work? What was the reaction in your office?
I remember that day very well, too. I was riding my bicycle in West Virginia. There's a long history of the North Koreans doing things. This goes all the way back to the 80s and even the 70s. I mean, people in the embassy used to complain. It always seemed to happen on an American holiday or a weekend. But I'm sure we were being far too self-referential and thinking that was the way it was. But I also remember before that October nuclear test, there were the July 4th missile tests the same year, 2007. But yes, you're right to point to this was the first nuclear test. And now, of course, there have been 6, right?
Yep.
But that first one was, you know, before it happened, this red line meaning if you cross it, something really, really changed. Well, what was going to change? I think it did concentrate minds, and it did lead to another effort to get going with the SixParty Talks. And it also showed that at that time, you know, China and Russia within the Security Council was ready to take very strong action, not military action, but very strong action in the Security Council to sanction North Korea on the basis of that. So in a way, I guess one could say it did lead us back into diplomacy.
Right, but when you arrived in Seoul in October 2008 as ambassador, the SixParty Talks had more or less stalled. The second phase of the 6th round of talks had broken up over a year previously in September 2007. So what were you expecting when you arrived here? What was the state of play?
Right. Well, the state of play was that, things were not going well. I think we'd had in June of that year, if I recall correctly, the explosion that took down the Yeonpyeong cooling tower, which was symbolic, but nonetheless, it was kind of an important moment to say, you know, progress is being made and to reinforce the North Koreans that there were, you know, some benefits to continuing on this road. But we were in a point where we were working from getting the North Koreans to declare their programs, to kind of give us a list of what they had, knowing, and this is again the argument we would have in Washington and with others, is knowing that if they gave us a list, it probably wasn't going to be complete.
Right.
But nonetheless, it was useful to have a list. It was useful to have inspectors there.
Yeah.
And then from that, we would have to go to a verification regime, which we knew would be the most difficult, but because verification means
sending
people in to places where the North Koreans don't want them to go.
Right.
You know, this very, very closed place.
Yeah.
So that's where we were. There was also a presidential election coming up in the United States.
Right.
But I remember, actually in October, I got here late September, and in October, Chris Hill appeared with his team, and they made one last trip to Pyongyang, what turned out to be one last trip to Pyongyang, and they drove. They drove from Seoul up to Pyongyang.
Wow.
Came back down.
Not many people have made that drive.
Not many people have made that.
Have you ever made it?
I have not been to Pyongyang. I'm only as far as Kaesong.
All right.
But they went up to Pyongyang and came back down, and they knew that verification was going to be very tough, and it was. But I also remember Chris saying to me, the other thing I think was happening then, which hasn't been talked so much about in kind of the literature about that period, is Kim Jong-il was not well.
Already then?
Already then.
Okay.
And if you remember earlier that year, I mean, of course you don't, it's a long time ago, you know, there were those photographs of Kim Jong-il when he received former President Clinton, when former President Clinton went
to get Laura Lee and
pick
Laura
up
Ling
the
and
two
Lee.
journalists. That's right. And he was looking, you know, he lost a lot of weight, wasn't looking well. And, you know, we were hearing that he wasn't well. But Chris came back with the notion that decisions were not being made in Pyongyang. Again, maybe the historians later will have a better sense of this.
Sure.
But, you know, and as we look back again, as we look at what happened going forward, I mean, Kim Jong-un then starting to emerge, the Yeonpyeong and Cheonan sinking, and the apparent role of Kim Jong-un, and all of that. But in 2008, that last-ditch effort really was in September, October, to try to see if we could get the verification effort with some momentum. It wasn't happening. We had our election. President-elect Obama. This was an example where I think from Bush to Obama, there was continuity. You know, Obama said, we're going to pick this up and continue it. And picked Steve Bosworth, another former ambassador to South Korea, to be his special envoy for North Korea. But it really kind of sputtered out after that. And I do think that one big reason was the North Koreans at this point were beginning their own transition and were not prepared, especially then, to go any further, especially with things as sensitive to them as verification.
And then putting the spotlight on you personally for a moment, what were you expected to be able to do as a Korean-speaking ambassador, the first U.S. woman ambassador to South Korea, with so much experience and social capital built up in this country with the people and friends in high places?
Well, what was I expected to do? I mean, I always felt like the biggest expectations of any American ambassador to the Republic of Korea are from the Korean people, right? I knew from living here in the 70s and the 80s, and especially in the 80s, working for two ambassadors, Dixie Walker and Jim Lilly, I knew how enormous the scrutiny was of an American ambassador here. You know, I think in Washington, I don't know if there were huge expectations. I mean, I think that there was also some worry, some skepticism. I mean, how would the Koreans accept a woman, you know? And I was a little different from some of the other ambassadors who come before. But what I was very mindful of is the kind of, not just scrutiny I would receive, but also that Koreans have such high and sometimes misplaced and sometimes it's distorted expectations, or maybe even in some cases dread of what the American role is here. And so my, I guess, hope for myself was that having spent a substantial amount of time living in Korea over the decades, that I wouldn't be just a kind of Rip Van Winkle or kind of an anachronism, but sort of think, you know, there's a complexity to this relationship, and it's a very unusual place to be American ambassador. I mean, you could say American ambassador anywhere because, you know, it's pretty high profile.
Right.
But we have such a special relationship with this country. So I think I was very sensitive as I came here to seeing if I could do something to try to ensure that, which is what ambassadors should, embassies should, you know, understand a little better, communicate a little bit better, both back to Washington,
right,
about the complexities of this place.
Yeah.
And we didn't have things like NK News then, right? So,
no, sadly.
And to Koreans. I mean, the fact, you know, I just decided I'm going to try to brush off with my very rusty Korean. And, you know, I knew that, I mean, unlike if I'd been ambassador in Paris and spoken French and people would have said, oh, so what, you know, or in Mexico, and people thought it was a big deal here that I spoke Korean, but thought better of me for trying. You know, I worried a little bit that, you know, it's not perfect. As you know, Koreans can be very demanding, very high expectations of people. But I thought it was kind of worth the risk. And also that I would reach beyond kind of the elite and the people that we normally talk to and make sure that you know, this sounds very Peace Corps-like, I suppose. But yeah, I spent a lot of my life in this country not living in Seoul. But like so many people whether we came here first 50 years ago or last week, it's a country that kind of grabs you, but it's a really complicated place. So I guess I had a sort of a project that I hope would be helpful to U.S.-Korea relations. It was my own kind of project of just trying to understand better and seeing if that could help make sure that we avoided some of the kind of misunderstandings and worse that we've had in the past.
Yeah, I guess that in South Korea, the role of an American ambassador is a lot more public diplomacy than it would be in some other countries.
I think that's right. I mean, I do think that generally speaking, that diplomacy, like politics, has become much more, what do they say, kind of retail, you know, that, and especially in a democracy and in social media, that's you can't really have effective diplomacy or an effective alliance relationship if you don't have fairly broad understanding and support from people.
Right.
And certainly given the decisive role in many ways the U.S. has played in this country for the last 70 years, for better or worse, I always felt that kind of the Achilles heel of the alliance almost was public opinion.
Yeah.
And not that you just play to that, but you try to understand it and, you try to take it into account in moving forward.
Thank you. That's a very insightful answer. Let's now jump forward to April 14, 2009, when North Korea officially pulled out of the Six-Party Talks and said it would resume nuclear enrichment after it had a failed satellite launch. And just about a month and a half later, on May 25th, 2009, North Korea did its second underground nuclear test. And you'd been in office as ambassador for about 6 months. Did you, at that stage, begin to lose any hope and think, that's it, we failed?
No, I mean, I never lose hope, and I never think we failed. But I've also felt, in a way, I wanted to play my position, and playing my position is to make sure that we were as well aligned as possible as we could be with our allies here in Seoul. That we were, because defense is a part of this too. That I was working with U.S. Forces Korea and all those relationships to make sure that we were paying attention and to deterrence. But I also had confidence that Steve Bosworth is a very experienced diplomat who deeply, deeply was committed to seeing what would work, and he was trying hard. He did, but I think my sense at that point was the North Koreans at this point just really aren't ready for talks. And again, it seemed without us knowing exactly what was going on that, part of this was that transition. I mean, remember, we had this, people think now about Kim Jong-un as having come to power very quickly after his, at a young age, and that's all true in a way. But from the time that Kim Jong-il, I guess, first became ill or got a stroke in about maybe 2008, maybe early 2008, I may have the date, to his death at the end of 2011, that was more than 3 years.
Yeah.
It was more or less the time I was in Seoul as ambassador as well.
Right.
So I think we were just, being very watchful. And shortly, and I'm sure you'll get to this, but after that, then we had the sinking of the Cheonan.
Coming up,
yeah. And the shelling of Yeonpyeong-do. So I think we all understood that, there was not going to be a resumption of the Six-Party Talks, and the North Koreans were not ready to come to the table. But there were also efforts, as always, even the Lee Myung-bak government, a conservative government, was trying, and this is, again, part of the public record now, to have some kind of back channel with North Korea. And we stayed in, constant touch of things like the Kaesong Industrial Park, does that stay open? Does that close? I mean, all those things, there was a lot, what happened with Gumgang-sam, which had been closed, earlier on after the shooting death of a tourist. This is kind of a trip down memory lane now.
Right.
But I think it's indicative of where we always are with North Korea, even when, if you like, sort of nothing much is happening, or when only bad things are happening. There's a lot of work going on to try to make sure that, if you like, it doesn't escalate, and to try to keep some lines open, even if they're never picked up on, but also to really try to do everything you can to reassure and work together with not only Seoul, but also, Tokyo and others who are going to be affected.
Well, you mentioned President Lee Myung-bak, so I'm just wondering how, obviously, different presidents work in coordinate better or worse in different ways with the embassy. And I'm wondering how the U.S. embassy worked together with Lee Myung-bak at that time. Was that a good collaboration?
It was a good collaboration. And I have to say, I think with pretty much every Korean administration, every Korean president, there may have been, times and moments or individuals when it's been a little bit bumpy. But generally, we have a long history of working together closely. And I don't think any ambassador here, and for that matter, American diplomats, have ever had any lasting problem with, for example, access and having the closest possible relationships with those not only in the president's office, what used to be called the Blue House, and in the relevant ministries. The other thing about Lee Myung-bak is, somewhat to everyone's surprise, he and President Obama established a really good relationship. President Obama was kind of famous for being a bit of a kind of a loner, or a little bit of an introvert. But he really enjoyed President Lee Myung-bak. And not so much on North Korea, but just on things like research and development and education policy. He was, again, kind of taken with Korea, President Obama was. And,
I remember he came in and gave that talk in which you mentioned Cacao Talk.
The what? Which one?
He gave a speech at, I think, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in which he talked about Cacao Talk. And then for a while there, Koreans had, as many Koreans had Obama's voice as the alert. So you hear Kakao talk when they got a message.
That's right. No, he was very taken with Korea. So all of that underpins, obviously, an ability for the ambassador, the embassy to work together. And also, kind of means it just smooths things in terms of working, whether it's on North Korea or the free trade agreement, or obviously, the other thing I guess to say, maybe I should have said it earlier on about being ambassador in Seoul, being American ambassador in Seoul is you are the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea. And North Korea is clearly a part of our policy agenda with South Korea, but there's a lot of other things as well.
Right. Now, obviously, policy is decided in Washington and run out of there. But to what extent does the embassy here have a voice in what's going on there?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the issue and relationships, because I think another thing that's very important for an embassy and especially ambassador to do is to maintain kind of credibility back in Washington.
Right. Not to be seen to have gone native.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, it varies over time. But you communicate through cables. Actually, another thing that happened, I almost hesitated to mention it because I send people scurrying, but we had the WikiLeaks.
When was that? I've forgotten now exactly.
Shotgun, I'm trying to think.
Right.
That was like 2000, also about 2010, I think. And so, so those cables, are ways in which you're not making policy, but you're sometimes making some policy recommendations,
right.
But you're also, again, trying to give us a sense of where Seoul is on some issues. And, it's as communications have changed again over the years, you pick up the phone, you send emails, you do a lot of different things, you go to meetings. And of course, we have, a lot of visitors who come to Seoul at any time in the relationship and see their counterparts face to face. So, yeah, I think there's kind of policy as it evolves over a longer term, and an example of that would be our approach to the free trade agreement, which was negotiated but then kind of renegotiated or adjusted or whatever through another administration, and you have a lot of people who get involved in how those adjustments were made, and the embassy certainly weighs in and has a voice in that. But then you also have times when there's, I'd say more of a moment of crisis. And, for example, after the Yeonpyeong shelling, there was great concern in Washington about whether or not South Korea would go too far in responding to the North Korean attack and worry about how that might embroil the United States. So, when you talk about making policy, I don't think of it in a think tanky sense. Like, okay, we've decided this is our policy in a very abstract way, and now we will pursue it.
Right.
Oftentimes it's in the crucible of events as they are unfolding, and certainly, you hope that the embassy and the ambassador, as the eyes and ears on the ground, are going to be a part of that discussion.
To round off our bet on the SixParty Talks, on 29th of February 2012, there was the Leap Day Agreement in which the U.S. agreed to provide food aid in return for a moratorium and a return of IAEA inspectors and a restart of SixParty Talks. This deal pretty much ended on the 16th of March when North Korea said it would launch a satellite, which failed on the 6th of April. By this stage, you were back in D.C. as Under-Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, which I think was your last position at the State Department before retiring from the Foreign Service. Did you initially think that the Leap Day Agreement would or could lead to something more tangible, more permanent?
Well, of course, I hoped it would get us back into a process of dialogue and diplomacy with North Korea, and I was disappointed when it ended as it did.
So quickly,
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so next topic here. There was a big movement, I recall, in U.S. North Korea. Well, okay, maybe not relations, but anyway, there was a movement when the U.S. under President George W. Bush removed North Korea from its list of state sponsors of terrorism in October 2008, the month you arrived.
Right.
Did you see that as a big step at the time?
It was a step that was important to the North Koreans, and it was a step that was taken, in hopes that it would encourage the North Koreans towards that declaration verification process that we were on. So I definitely think it was worth taking. Again, I know it was something that was heavily criticized by some because, you don't have to look too far back to see North Korea as having supported terrorist actions. And indeed, I was living in Korea in 1984 when the Rangoon bombing occurred. I was living here in 1987 when they blew up that plane. So nobody had to tell me, how, these were terrorist acts that North Korea did. This law was written in a way that was saying, have you done something over the last 6 months?
Right.
So It was, again, one of these steps that I think made sense and which I supported in the context of what we were trying to do. It also didn't have any practical effect on our ability to pressure North Korea or to maintain sanctions on them. But it was something that was used, I think, by those who wanted to say we were, being too soft on an odious regime. So that's the challenge of talking to these regimes and the tools you use.
Right. And then President Trump put them back on the designated list in November 20th, 2017, so a bit less than 10 years later. But looking back, you still believe it was the right thing to do at the time in 2008?
I think it was worth the risk. I was involved, and I won't get on too much of a tangent here, but I was involved for a number of years in the Northern Ireland peace process.
I've got a question about that later.
Heavily controversial in the United States and within the State Department and so on. And President Clinton at that time, he talked about you have to take risks for peace. And they may say, you do have to take some risks. And this was a risk, but this was not a risk that I think, resulted in endangering somebody. It was a risk to see if we could pull the North Koreans a little bit further along in what we were trying to do. And, should we get back into a process of diplomacy with the North Koreans? There'll be some trading. I mean, sanctions, things will be on the table before we've gotten to the end state that we'd like. That's
right.
The reality.
Now, we've already hinted a few times at 2010, so let's talk about that year. That was a year of some violent action between North and South Korea, but I want to, even before 2010, just go back a little bit to November 10, 2009. There was the all but forgotten Daecheong incident, also known as the Battle of Daecheong, in which there was an exchange of fire between two North and South Korean boats off the coast of one of the islands possessed by South Korea near the northern limit line in the West Sea. And apparently some North Koreans came off the worse for wear in the sea battle. I don't know if any of them died, but they didn't come out of it well. A little over 3 months later, on March 26, 2010, the corvette named the ROK as Cheonan sank near the coast of Pyeongdo, another one of those islands, just to the north of Daecheongdo. In this sinking, 46 ROK sailors were lost, many of them young conscripts. And ultimately, as you recall, of course, an international investigation led by South Korea found that, quote, the Cheonan was split and sunk due to a shock wave and bubble effect generated by the underwater explosion of a torpedo, unquote. This torpedo is believed to have been fired by North Korea deliberately to sink the Cheonan. North Korea to this day denies it, and the Chinese and Russians do not agree with this report. Do you believe that North Korea did it?
I do. You mentioned other troubles in the West Sea, and certainly something I think all of us who watch the Korean Peninsula are aware of is that there's a lot of action out there in the West Sea that's quite dangerous at any moment. A lot of people are focused on the land border, the DMZ, but the West Sea is in many ways even more fragile, I would say, in some ways. And I distinctly recall, of course, that day in 2010 when I got a phone call from the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, General Sharp, to say there'd been a ship sunk, disappeared. I think it was very early on,
right?
And we were going to try to find out what had happened, obviously. So I was very involved in following every step as we talked with the South Koreans, worked with the South Koreans as they put together this international commission to look into what happened. And yeah, I would just say, to be brief about it, yes, I am absolutely convinced that the ship was sunk by a North Korean torpedo.
Do you think it was likely done in retaliation for the Battle of Daecheong just 3 months earlier?
Okay. I don't know.
Now, as you recall, there was a lot of skepticism among the public in South Korea, who did not necessarily all believe that the Cheonan was sunk by a North Korean torpedo. Even one member of the investigative team, Shin Sang-chol, who was later accused of spreading rumors, spoke out against it. How did you, as ambassador, use your social capital and diplomatic skills to try to persuade the South Korean public that this was actually an attack carried out by North Korea?
Yeah, I do think that some of the skepticism is evidence of the distrust that does exist in the society about issues related to North Korea and the security situation here, and a sense that they sometimes become politicized and the U.S. gets involved and so on and so forth. So, well, no, I spoke what I knew to be fact as I knew it, and spoke with those who were investigating this in great detail. I watched it all very carefully. And I just told people what I've told you now, that I was in no doubt that this was what had happened. And I think the evidence is there for people to see.
Right.
But,
I mean, you could literally you can go and see the Cheonan. It's on display at the ROK Naval Base.
It's on display, right? Yeah. And I mean, the kind of late in the investigation, and of course, some people thought this was suspicious itself. But I watched this whole thing unfold. The South Koreans were out kind of dredging the ocean bottom. It's not that deep there, I guess. And they actually netted or whatever is this torpedo bit that was right. And pulled it up and had this marking on it. And I watched this whole thing unfold, and I was thoroughly convinced. And again, watching this and having worked in government, the conspiracies are not that easy to do, right? Yeah. It's complicated, and most of the things I heard denying this involve very kind of complicated, convoluted conspiracy theories. And I saw, one, no evidence of that, but two, I just doubt the ability of all the various parts involved. And it wasn't just the South Korean government or the U.S. or the military. It was an international team. And as I recall, I think the Russians, they didn't sign on to the final report, but it was an international report that I think had Swedes and some other Europeans on it, Australians, and I had a chance to really sit down and go over the report with all of them. And so that's what it was.
And then we go to the end of the year. Then November 23rd, there was the shelling of Yeonpyeong. Now, I remember that day too. I was here in Seoul. It really mentally shook a lot of people in Seoul. They feared the worst. Were you here in Seoul at the time?
I was, and in fact, I had just gotten in my car, my ambassadorial car, with my driver and my one female Korean police bodyguard to drive to Incheon Airport. And we were just getting out, kind of just a mile or so from the embassy on the way, because I was going to the U.S. It was
an already scheduled.
It was already scheduled. My luggage was already out there, actually. The perks of being an ambassador, right? And I was out there, and my driver, Mr. Kim, said to me in Korean, he said, "There's a report of some kind of attack." And so we were listening to the radio, and then my phone rang in the car. We had phones, and it was again General Sharp saying, that there's been this shelling, and I already said. And I said, "Should I stay?" And he said, "I really think you should."
Because it might send the wrong signal if you were leaving.
Right. Well, and if, we didn't know what had happened yet again. So, right. But in any event, it's not so much about me, but I actually did end up going because I was supposed to be meeting then the ambassador in Washington, Han Duck-soo, who's now the prime minister here. And it was Thanksgiving, and I was seeing my mother. I had, and I got on this plane, but I had turned up and had to come right back is what happened.
Goodness.
But the part I wanted to relate to you was, we got out to Incheon Airport, and I'm still hemming and hawing about should I go and what's happened and talking to people. And we got out.
Incheon, just for our listeners, Incheon not that far from Yeonpyeong Island. I mean, Yeonpyeong is, I think, part of, well, anyway, it's close to Incheon.
Right. So Incheon is out there in the West Sea, right? It's kind of on reclaimed land, or the airport, right?
Yeah.
So we got out there, and the car pulls up, and I'm getting out, and I'm still trying to decide, do I get my luggage and get back in the car, or do I? And this was also in 2010. I don't know if you remember, smartphones were just becoming really widespread in Korea. We were just making that transition, and Korea was a pretty early adopter. And as I got out of the car, I saw all these people at the airport standing out there on the curb with their smartphones, watching little videos on their smartphones of the shells coming down. I thought, wow, this is hitting people immediately.
Yes.
And I'm telling you that anecdote at length because, unlike the sinking of the Cheonan, right? It was so immediate.
Yep.
Everyone felt it.
Yeah.
And so in the ensuing days, and yes, I got on the plane, I went to California, I came back immediately, and then was involved in the whole kind of response to the Yeonpyeong-do shelling. People felt it. The mood here was so different.
Yeah.
I think it was the first time that many people, especially those of a somewhat younger generation, felt like, wow, something could really happen.
Well, how concerned were you that something could really happen?
Well, I was concerned, and we were immediately into this discussion then of how to respond. And
right.
I think that the Lee Myung-bak government felt under considerable pressure to show, and again, this was just a few months after the Cheonan sinking, to respond rather forcefully.
In a perhaps disproportionate manner, right?
Yeah.
So did he need to be talked down from that?
There were long discussions about what would be the right kind of response. And I think Bob Gates, who was the defense secretary, writes a little bit about this in his book. But I think it is an example of where both sides obviously felt something had to be done. But the question was what? And, what would be too much or too provocative? And also just gauging the mood in each capital. So, that was a very intense time. and also for our presence here, our joint presence, and a lot of concern on the part of the military about planning going forward. How do we stop something like this from happening again? How do we make sure that we think through? Because I think it was also for all the planning we do in the military and in diplomacy and so on. Something always happens you didn't really sort of think about, in a way.
Of course.
So, what other things do we need to make sure we do so that we don't have an unintended escalation, and that we do, decide at what level decisions need to be made and who runs what and so on and so forth. So even after all these years of, military alliance on the Korean Peninsula, that was a time when we had to think those things through freshly.
For our listeners who may not be aware or who may not remember, how did it ultimately end? What was the decided response?
South Korea did some exercises, and kind of a show of force and reinforced.
So shooting back into the water again.
Yeah. I mean, I'd have to really look, honestly, at the record to see exactly what the details were. But it was, it was a proportionate but strong response.
Right.
And then there was also, I think, a lot of things that kind of behind the scenes in terms of thinking through, what we could do to try to prevent something like that from happening again.
Because I seem to vaguely recall some reporting that Lee Myung-bak came close to scrambling some jets. As far as you know, did that ever happen?
I don't really want to talk about the specifics too much, but I mean, I think that that clearly there was talk about a lot of different options,
right.
And I think in the end, what was important was that we stayed well knit up.
Cooler heads prevailed, and there was.
I wouldn't say cooler heads, but there was a sense we had to be together on this.
Right, got to be aligned. Yeah. Okay, now let's talk about the Kaesong Industrial Zone, which opened for business back in December 2004. I believe you visited it as ambassador?
I didn't visit as ambassador. I visited as an official from Washington, and in fact, I was the senior-most official to visit at the time, because at that time, that was 2006 or 7, we were negotiating the free trade agreement.
Right.
And the South Koreans, this is under the Yeonpyeong government, wanted to introduce the idea of maybe extending free trade provisions to the Kaesong Industrial Project. That was kind of a non-starter in the United States.
Labeled Made in Republic of Korea.
Something like that.
Made in Kaesong.
You have a better memory than I do about it. But there was that. There was that. And then there was just also the whole, and this goes back to the discussion about North Korean human rights, sort of the debate over whether or not the Kaesong Industrial Park was an abuse of human rights of North Koreans, or it was something that was going to be part of, an opening and improved life and so on. So having an American official go to the Kaesong Industrial Park, I wasn't the only one, but I happened to be the senior-most one, was kind of an event, if you like. But it was also an interesting opportunity for me to see it.
What did you make of it? I've never been, for the record.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it reminded me, we human beings were always reminded of something else. It reminded me of Shenzhen. I was assigned to Guangzhou in the early 80s, and the industrial parks there.
Oh, that was very new back then, Shenzhen.
Yeah, they were just building in the early 80s. So I saw that, and it reminded me of that. All the facilities were quite a bit nicer, I'd say. It also reminded me a little bit of the South Korea I knew in the 1970s,
Mm-hmm.
The shoe factories and the textile factories I used to visit in Busan and in Gyeongsang-do that had the middle school girls and the high school girls, working there. It was a mostly female workforce.
Right. To clarify, though, in Kaesong, they were all adults, I think, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. I say, yeah. But I mean, in terms of the, just the kind of industry there was, yeah.
Yeah, light industry, small scale.
Light industry, mostly female workforce. Maybe because I'm a woman, I see the gender issue of it too.
Right.
Mostly South Korean managers.
That's true.
Lots of choco pie around. The workers did look better fed, I would say, than what seemed to be your average, North Korean, and I don't think we were being mistreated. But there were a number of issues, and obviously one was, as you have in other countries, like authoritarian countries or communist countries, is they did not get their wages directly from their employer. The wages went to the state, if you like, and then they got a small fraction of that.
Right.
So that was one of the things. I thought if the idea is a gradual opening, this is part of it. But the thing that struck me the most, I guess I would say, is I was shown a film. This is like being in South Korea. You go, and I was shown this promotional film of what Kaesong is going to be like in 5 years or 10 years.
Yeah.
And it was golf courses, and it was hotels, and it was, all these different things.
So it was an industrial zone and a
tourist
park.
It was this huge vision. And I thought, this is great. And I've seen a lot of films about this for different areas of South Korea, and I never thought it would happen. And then it happened. But this will not happen in North Korea absent some kind of greater change.
Right.
I didn't see how they could digest all that.
Yeah.
So, but that's, again, is the argument, I guess, for the gradualist approach, that if you've gotten that in there, you get it going, that you should kind of keep pushing for something that's going to change the context and bring about the kind of gradual change you want. But, we found it's very hard in North Korea. And, and in the meantime, I do understand that there's always been concerns about the way it was set up. But it was a symbol of inter-Korean cooperation. And so I think the decision to close it, which I think was finally during the Park Geun-hye government, I believe. You're more of an expert on this than I am.
That's actually the last question I'm coming up to on this section. Did you meet any North Korean officials or talk to any North Korean workers while you were there?
Yeah, well, I mean, we had a guide, an English-speaking guide, a young woman who was North Korean. She was very impressive. I talked very briefly to some of the young workers there. I mean, just a few words. But no, it was mainly the guide and a couple of other officials. But we went through a little customs thing and so on and so forth. But I think it was a vision that had some good justifications for it, and I understand why successive governments were reluctant to, on the South Korean side, were reluctant to close it.
Right.
But I think, again, for North Korea, these things are like a little virus, right? I guess I shouldn't talk about viruses after COVID, but, I think that's always been the challenge in North Korea. So why hasn't it gone the way of Shenzhen in China and, or reform in Vietnam? It's they've got South Korea on the other side, and I think they can only take so much before it becomes a bit of a threat.
Does it show, I mean, it was in a sense also, amongst other things, a trust-building exercise. Mm-hmm. Does it show the limits of trying to build trust between North and South Korea? Because going back to, as you mentioned there, that sense that too much contact with South Korea can taint North Koreans or make them ideologically weakened.
I think the North Koreans do put these limits on it themselves. But human beings are human beings, so I'm kind of in favor of doing it, I guess, in general terms. And I know you've talked to a number of people, and unfortunately there haven't been projects like this for a long time. But there are a lot of projects, not just inter-Korean projects of planting trees and TB assistance, but not only from South Koreans but from foreigners, from Americans and Europeans and others. And all of them are little microcosms about if you get on the ground and you work with people, you can build these relationships. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily lead automatically to kind of broader change that you might want, because it's a more difficult problem than that.
Yeah. Oh, that kind of preempts the last question which I had, which is that President Park Geun-hye closed it for good in 2016, recalling all the workers. It seems now that the North Koreans are using the facilities for their own means. But your assessment is that basically it was the right thing to try. It didn't work out, but you got to put people and people together, and that's what they did.
Yeah, I think so. And now we're at a period after North Korea has been in greater self-isolation than anything that the outside world's been able to impose because of the COVID-19. And I don't think any of us really know where things stand now.
That's true.
But I guess I remain, and I hope not naively so, but in favor of contact and also getting information in. Getting people out, getting information in, and trying to engage in any way you can. That's I've never found quite the right verb, but maybe engage is the one I'll use. With a mind too, you want to do it in a way that's not going to directly strengthen the regime or support activities that are abhorrent to us.
I've got one question about Mount Kumgang, a tourist region. That was opened back in '98. I was here in Korea then. I remember the excitement of people hopping on a ship to make a couple of day cruise to North Korea. And then in July 2008, almost 10 years later, a 53-year-old South Korean tourist named Park Gwang-ja was shot twice and killed just a few months before your arrival, while your confirmation was still pending before the U.S. Senate. And South Korea's president at the time, Lee Myung-bak, had requested a joint inquiry into the shooting, but North Korea rejected this. By April 2010, North Korea had seized a number of properties at the resort owned by South Korea and allowed companies to run tours in from the northern side. Since then, they've now demolished some of the South Korean facilities. What was your reaction to the shooting at the time? And did you, when you came here as ambassador, advise the South Korean government at all on how it should try to get a joint inquiry or how it should approach things?
I don't think the South Korean government really needed much advice from me on that. I mean, I thought what they were asking for was, obviously within their rights. I had to decide. I do recall meeting with the president of the Hyundai or the Kumgang Resort operation, who of course was very interested in seeing it reopen. But I think it was a shame. It's a shame that it closed. At the same time, I guess in terms of its impact, I think for the Gumgang tourist resort, as much as I'd love to see the Diamond Mountains.
Yeah. Oh, you've not been?
Well, only on Gangwon-do, South Korea side,
yes.
but no, I never went. But that the argument that it was a little bit more of a cash cow for North Korea without the sort of potential to introduce the sorts of reforms or changes, whatever you want to call them, that Kaesong might offer. I mean, I think that's a valid point.
There was indeed much less mingling.
Much less mingling, right. So, no, I think you have to be smart about these things. We've seen when you have your citizens who are not safe, I mean, a government has to think about that.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's already been closed for longer than it was ever opened.
Yeah.
So moving on to the death of Kim Jong-il, right? 17th of December 2011, I was working at the Dragon Hill Lodge Hotel here on Yongsan Garrison.
Wow.
Running tours for American soldiers and their families. And I remember, so that news came in pretty quick, and it was, as a tour company, it was immediately relevant to us because that meant no JSA tours for the foreseeable future because you don't know what's going to go on there. So your term as ambassador ended in October, so just almost 6 weeks or so, less than 2 months before Kim Jong-il died, when your successor Song Kim was still fresh in the chair. Where were you when you heard the news that Kim Jong-il had died?
I was in Washington, and of course it had been expected for a long time.
Right, because of the strokes and things.
Right, and so it didn't come as any surprise. What I do recall about that period is, first of all, I guess I'm glad that I was fairly quiet in what I said publicly for the next few months, because I think a lot of the people who had things to say turned out to be really wrong. Not to say that I'm not wrong about a lot of things, but the predictions we make about things having to do, especially with North Korea, turn out sometimes to be, disproved.
Yeah.
And in this case, there was so much about he's been to boarding school in Switzerland and he's young and he's going to be open to the West. And so there was that. And then there was another one saying, well, he's so young and he's so weak that Tang Sung-taek, his uncle, is going to be in charge of everything, or the military is going to take over. We didn't know, right? And I guess I mean in the broadest possible sense, right?
Yeah.
And he, as North Korea, and maybe South Korea too, so often does, kind of disproved all of those that sort of received or conventional wisdom, and turned out to be brutal and resilient.
Well, here we are. It's May 2023, and you're still very much involved in Korea, both at the Korea Society and the Korea Economic Institute, and you visit Seoul multiple times each year. South Korea has changed so much since you first came here in 1975, but not that much has changed in North Korea, relatively speaking. So as an American who has a special love for Korea and Koreans, what do you hope for North Korea?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say that North Korea has changed in a lot of ways, and things are very different than they were 40, 50 years ago, both with respect to kind of its relationship or its relative weight vis-a-vis South Korea, and a number of other ways too, its understanding of the outside world and so on. Yeah, what I would say is North Korea has also turned out to be very resilient. And what would be my hopes, is your question?
Yeah.
Well, my hopes would be that, and I don't want to sound, sort of preachy about this, but to me it's 70 years since the armistice, 70 years since at least the ceasefire that ended that terrible, terrible war that divided so many millions and millions of families and Koreans. And, I mean, North Korea is populated by the same kind of Koreans who built South Korea. And I have seen in my lifetime, in my career, so much, change, obviously, in South Korea, for that matter, in China.
Yeah.
And my hope is to see these millions of North Koreans begin to have some of the same opportunities to live with some dignity and freedom, if I can use that word, and opportunity, and to reunite with their families. I don't know if that means an immediate reunification as a political entity, but I think there needs to be some reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula, and I hope it can be done in a way that addresses the human tragedy here, even as the very complicated geopolitical and security issues are going to be very hard to resolve. But I think there's a human tragedy that we can't lose track of, and in a way we see it every day in North Korea, and that really is, to me, the fundamental human rights challenge of North Korea as well.
Now, you were, at one stage, principal officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Belfast, Northern Ireland, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Are there any major points that could be learned from that agreement with respect to North and South Korea in terms of reconciliation moving forward?
Yeah, there's one, and it's really about negotiations, I think. And again, it's with the proviso that the stipulation that they're vastly different situations.
Yeah.
So I don't want to, this is simplistic, I acknowledge. But, we were really stuck multiple times in the negotiations that finally resulted in the Good Friday Agreement over the question of decommissioning of terrorist weapons. That meant like Simtex, things you blow up buildings and people with.
Yeah.
And a peace process. And, you couldn't have any peace process until you had decommissioning. And we had to work that out. We had to work out a way where we could have a negotiation where you move forward, you didn't give up on decommissioning, but you still move forward on the broader, whether you call it a peace process or a political process or whatever. You had to. And to me, that's kind of a lesson that I think people know in a way, that we need to do that with North Korea, too. We want to see a North Korea that does not have nuclear weapons. I don't want to see South Korea have nuclear weapons either. To me, that's another subject, but that's not a recipe for
hot topic these days.
Better, hot topic. But I don't think we can't have a diplomacy that's based solely on give up your nuclear weapons and then we'll talk. And that's not where I think we are. Let me hasten to add. But we have to keep that in mind. And that's what finally kind of got us going in Northern Ireland, among other things, is finding a way to have, again, whether you call it a dual track approach or, broader framework or whatever, that's what you have to have. And it's just a way of saying I don't separate the inter-Korean process and the question of peace and reconciliation from the challenge of ensuring that nuclear weapons do not have a place on the Korean Peninsula.
Right. So the inter-Korean process is in a way central, even though there are outside players who are also involved. Now, during the last 30 years, from that time when Bill Clinton almost had a preemptive strike, and then George W. Bush talked about the axis of evil, and SixParty Talks, President Obama's strategic patience, through President Trump's 2.5 summits, plus the whose button is bigger talk, and now President Biden trying to call North Korea, but they won't pick up the phone. At what time during this 30 years were you most hopeful of, no, hopeful is the wrong word, but did you think, this might actually lead somewhere?
Yeah. I wasn't so involved in the agreed framework, so I can't really comment on that. And I know people who were involved were hopeful that would lead to something. I was in 2007 hopeful when we got to the point where we had inspectors at Yeonpyeong that we could keep moving forward. But I also was under no illusion about how difficult it was. And again, I would just say that is not unique to Korea. I mean, this has clearly been such a longstanding and seemingly intractable. Is that
intractable?
Intractable. Thank you. Intractable issue. But if you look at any negotiation or any issue, whether it's the ones I've worked on within the Balkans or Northern Ireland, we could pick some others.
You have been, in some tough places.
It's one step forward and two steps back. And even when you have an agreement, the agreement's broken, you pick it up, you start again. So, there's the Korean proverb about fall down 7 times, get up 8 times. And I think, you have to apply that to North Korea. But I would also add, I think that the issue has become, or the challenge has become, even greater, because unlike in pre-2007, 6, we, North Korea has nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
We're just in a different position now, and they see themselves in a different position. And the obvious point, the geopolitical framework in which we are operating is so different. So it's hard to be, to kind of draw a lot of hope from something that happened earlier, because I think it is much more challenging now. But I still think we need to draw some lessons from it. And I do think that historical context and an understanding of the importance, instead of the inter-Korean element, remains essential.
Mm. Is there a time when you were most fearful that a conflict might flare up into something bigger?
It's a funny thing here, isn't it? I mean, I'm going way back now, but, I was a Peace Corps volunteer when there was the axe incident. I was in the 80s. We had the North Koreans, was clearly them, blowing up the whole presidential party in Rangoon, and then blowing up a plane and, capturing this North Korean agent who was this beautiful young woman who came to Seoul. There's all this drama, and I was kind of had a ringside seat for some of this, So you always know the danger is there. It can escalate. And then more recently in 2010. But I do think over the years, I don't want to be, we cannot be complacent about it. But I do think that the fact that we've had 70 years when the alliance, if I can sound like the ambassador now a little bit, has effectively deterred war. Yeah, it's sort of like an earthquake, yes, we have to always be on our, maybe earthquake's not the right thing to say, but we always have to be kind of on our guard about it and know that there are some fault lines there that are very, very real. but mitigate in every way we can and find a way to get to more, I'm going to really mix my metaphors here, to more stable ground.
Right. No, that seems like a good metaphor. Now, in 1848, British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston said in Parliament, "We have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies." That's a good quote. Can North Korea and the U.S. ever be friends?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely.
Is that something that you hope for, you look forward to?
Well, I answered very quickly because, when you say North Korea, I'm thinking again of the people of North Korea.
Right.
And again, the U.S. has a history with Korea even before it was divided.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There used to be, I guess it's probably mostly depopulated now, a retirement home somewhere, I think, in North Carolina, where most of the people there had gone to boarding school in Pyongyang. These were the children of missionaries in North Korea and China. And there are very deep roots there. Now, maybe that sounds like a bit of a tangent to go on. But no, I think that there's a feeling of even kinship, but a deep connection between Americans and Koreans. And I think that extends to the people of North Korea. Can the United States ever be friends with the DPRK as the DPRK? That's a more political question. I think we have certainly offered in the past to normalize relations under certain conditions. Would we do that with a DPRK that possessed nuclear weapons? I don't think so. But we can certainly have a much better relationship. But I don't think we can have a good relationship absent denuclearization. I finally used the word.
Yeah.
And some other changes, not necessarily change of regime, but changes in behavior on the part of North Korea.
Now, the flip side of that quote is no eternal allies. Can you ever see an end to the U.S. ROK military alliance, which Presidents Biden and Yoon recently updated and re-ratified with their Washington Declaration?
Again, I see the relationship between South Korea, the Korean people, but South Korea and the United States as broader and deeper than it's ever been. So when I use the word alliance now, I kind of think of a relationship that goes beyond the military alliance.
Right.
If your question is it immutable and unchangeable that there will always be U.S. troops in South Korea? No, I don't think so. There's a lot of things that will change, I'm sure, in the years ahead. But I think we have built a very deep kind of connection with Korea, much as we have in the United States, with others of our allies that sort of really goes beyond. And again, I'm not talking in terms of years now, but in terms of decades. But it goes beyond the kind of geopolitical framework of the times.
Now, historically, it's conservative South Korean governments have been viewed as more supportive of the U.S. alliance, and liberal ones a little bit less so. Is this changing in your view, and how does the challenge of China play a role in that?
I think of it this way. Democratization, if we count that from occurring in 1987 with the direct election of a president under the new constitution, which is still in force, and the transfer of power between the two parties or several parties by different names over the last several decades, democratization has been really good for the U.S.-Korea relationship and for the alliance. And I think that every Korean president, whatever the issues have been, whatever party he's been from or she, has recognized that a Korean president needs to manage the relationship with the United States, manage relationships in the region, and try to be the president who's going to get something done, positive, hopefully, with North Korea. And they've all tried in different ways to do that, but I think they've all been within, if you like, that framework. But yeah, I think that generally speaking, I talked a little bit earlier about how public opinion sometimes plays a big role in, obviously, politics here, but also in the alliance relationship. I remember Han Sung-ju, who was a foreign minister here, saying one time that I should always remember that when it came to issues involving the United States and South Korea, these weren't regarded as foreign policy issues. They were domestic policy issues. And I always thought that was pretty good advice, right? So we're just sort of handled in a different light here. So I think there's always that sensitivity. But I'm winding around to your answer. Yes, I think also when I look at what's happened in South Korea, regardless, again, of who's been in the presidential office over the last 25 years or so, and since normalization of relations with China in 1992, there was kind of a honeymoon period with China for a long time, right? I had a lot of Koreans would say to me, "Oh, we understand China. We've been around for thousands of years, and economically, this is it. We're going to really work this relationship." Now I think there's a lot more, as there is in the United States, concern, to put it mildly. And yeah, I mean, that clearly, I think, influences across the political spectrum how Koreans weigh their strategic choices. And they're not easy ones. But again, this is a country that's never had easy strategic choices, right?
Right.
But I think for now and going forward, I mean, for all the concerns that they have, and I know they have some about the United States' own political challenges and whatever other, baggage they may feel about the relationship or about the history of it, I think there's a strong awareness, and I see it in the polling. I saw there was some polling just this morning in the paper that suggests that Koreans understand that managing this relationship is really, really important.
Well, that's a good place to end it. Thank you very, very much, Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, for joining me here on the NK News podcast today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's been great talking to you. You can find her on Twitter at @AmbStephens, short for Ambassador Stephens. That brings us to the end of this podcast, ladies and gentlemen. If you already have an NK News account, and if you're a think tank, business, or academic institution, take a look at NK Pro. You're a subscriber, aren't you?
I am.
NK Pro platform offers unparalleled services specifically catering to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. Are you happy with it?
It's very good.
Excellent. You can inquire about access or a free trial membership by writing an email to membership@nknews.org today. Our thanks, as always, go to Brian Betts and Darius Dare for facilitating this podcast, and to our post-recording producer genius, Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, etc. Thank you very much, and listen again next time.